Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Noa Shaindlinger. Noa is the author of a recent book published by Edinburgh University Press in 2023, Displacement and Erasure in Palestine, the Politics of Hope. Before we will engage in our discussion about this book, which is focused mostly on Jaffa, a twin city for Jerusalem, a city that I would have loved to explore more in the podcast, I took the chance to discuss with Noa the current situation in Israel, Palestine, particularly in Gaza, as we are recording this episode just a few days following the brutal attack of Hamas on Israeli civilians outside the borders of Gaza, and the equally terrifying response by Israel against the civilian population of Gaza. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Noa, welcome.
Thank you.
I want to start talking about what's going on currently. We are recording this podcast about 10 days after the brutal attack perpetrated by Hamas militants, killing mostly civilians and also military targets in the settlements and towns surrounding the borders between Israel and Gaza. And we are also witnessing nowadays the brutal reactions perpetrated by the state of Israel, essentially removing people. We may speculate about 1 million that have been pushed from northern Gaza into southern Gaza, and also, obviously, the carpet bombing of Gaza, which means we will probably never know the exact tally of civilians that have been killed under these bombings. And so, before we're going to discuss your work, which in a sense connects with these events, connects with the first Nakba of 1948, I would like to ask you your thoughts about what happened and what's currently happening, and perhaps, you know, like I guess many of us have been involved with media and been asked about the future, and it's very hard to think about what may happen next. Noa, please.
Yeah, so as somebody who has been writing about the politics of hope, it's especially ironic that this, you're catching me in a moment of semi-despair, right? Obviously, despair at the genocidal violence that we're watching, right? With the full assent and complicity of, the Democratic administration, right, in the US, with the EU, the UK, right? That's one reason to despair. Another reason to despair is, of course, the political atmosphere in Israel. Right, to the point where I personally feel like I can't really speak to most Israelis, right? Like you can't even start a conversation, including with people who are close to you. It has gotten so extreme that, for example, this morning, a father of one of the POWs, right, who were taken to Gaza, was attacked on the street by supporters of Netanyahu for daring to demand, right, to return his daughter. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the political atmosphere, it has gone extremely violent, right, where I have friends in Israeli universities who are being threatened, right, to be terminated. Dozens of Palestinian citizens of Israel have been arrested and or terminated from their jobs, right? But I mean, I've also seen, and this is the sad thing, I have seen not a lot, not to that degree, but I have seen also a few people who are otherwise friends and colleagues and allies and partners posting on social media things that I feel are unproductive. Like, for instance, this morning, one of my really very long time friend and somebody who I organized with sort of posted something that really implied, be careful, Israeli Jews, what you do next will determine if we will allow you to be our neighbors after liberation. And I said, this is unhelpful because we want to prevent ethnic cleansing. We don't want anybody to be ethnically cleansed, right? And so his response was not very encouraging, right? So we see that. So it's a moment of despondence, I think, for a lot of us.
And I want to bring the question of also connected to the title of your book, The Politics of Hope, because in the middle of this sad and brutal news, then sometimes you get glimpse of humanity. As I woke up here in America, obviously it's already afternoon in Europe, and I had the chance to watch this interview by Maoz Inon. He lost his parents in the Hamas attack, and he was telling BBC, we must do everything to stop the war. And to have the courage to go and speak these words really speaks volume about the fact that there is, at least in my view, a glimpse of hope. And then maybe because I'm a cynical historian, then I open the comment sections, and that's where I see humanity disappearing, where you find people, oh, you're friends of terrorists, we're going to bus you to Gaza, we'll take you there. I mean, it's disturbing, really. You have voices of those who suffered directly at the hands of Hamas trying to say, yeah, it was awful, but there's another way. And then, as you said, the climate is horrifying. And it's not just in Israel. I mean, I've seen European countries now forbidding Palestinians to voice their, demonstrations against the war in Gaza, and colleagues who have been silenced for speaking their mind. And I know there are colleagues who are saying things I disagree with, but, I accept the fact that there's going to be a debate. And I personally find it very hard when I see people that can't reconcile, and this is my personal view, which I take the chance to share, that there's no contradictions in saying that what Hamas did is awful and non-human to a point, in a sense that, there's no justification for it. And at the same time is equally wrong the reaction of the state of Israel bomb carpeting Gaza and killing civilians and essentially reenacting a new Nakba and moving more than 1 million people out of their place, not knowing what's going to happen next. So I don't find it that hard, but I understand that we are in this period of our history where it's mostly dichotomy. It's either black or white, and it's very hard to, juggle through this kind of jungle, really.
I mean, let's not also lose sight of the fact that most people are decent people, right? Most people obviously don't support genocidal violence. Most people don't support, killing a bunch of grandmothers and grandfathers and their grandkids. I mean, if you think about Azmi Jara, who's the Palestinian intellectual who is in exile, he actually posted his own thoughts, and his voice, as always, has been clear. And he said what Hamas did is, of course, a crime against humanity, and he unequivocally, right, condemned what the Hamas did on October 7th, just as he condemns, obviously, the Israeli genocidal attacks on Gaza. And he also said, and, capturing civilians as opposed to soldiers, capturing civilians is also wrong, and they should be released immediately, right? Which I also appreciate, right? So, yes, there is a lot of rage, and there are many reasons to despair, but you actually, I think, still have a lot of human decency, right? And a lot of compassion around, right? Which we need to build on.
So on this note, I want to move to talk about the book. Can you tell us something about yourself and the origins of this book?
Sure. So I grew up in Tel Aviv, right? So these landscapes that I'm talking about are very familiar to me. And actually, as a child, I grew up right by the remains of the village of Salome, which was the largest village in the region of Jaffa. It was about 5,000 people, I believe, in 1946. And so as a child, I remember seeing their remains and asking my mom, about them. And she said, "Oh, never go there." And I asked why. And she said, "Well, because Arabs used to live here." So it was very clear to me since the beginning of grad school that I'm going to write something about Jaffa, right? Of course, the whole project went through all kinds of transformations because of the people I encountered, because of circumstances, because I actually started it in 2011, when 2011 was also when, if you recall, the big demonstrations in Tel Aviv started, right? Like the housing protests. And I participated in this. And so my project completely shifted. But this is how I also got to know a lot of people in Jaffa, right? And this is how this project shifted from being more rooted in kind of archival research to being rooted in this assemblage of sources, including, of course, ethnography, including speaking with a lot of live people, including extended stays in sites like Balata refugee camp, right?
I was wondering if you can provide the listeners with a short historical context into which your narrative is part of. And I want to also say and stress the fact that, to be honest, there's not much written about Jaffa. I mean, particularly compared to Jerusalem, or if you want to look at the nearby Tel Aviv, where obviously there's plenty of work done, but Jaffa remains largely unexplored from, almost all disciplines, whether it's anthropology, sociology, history, and politics.
I mean, most recently, there have been some interesting interventions, right? In anthropology, with Daniel Monteresco, who's done amazing work in Jaffa, and also has a unique insight as somebody who grew up in Jaffa and went to a non-Jewish school, right, and speaks Arabic and all of that. So that's one thing. There has been, I actually collected a lot of things that have been written about Jaffa before I even started writing my dissertation. And there's a lot written in Hebrew, right? And it's all very uncritical stuff, right? That's fine. I was going to write about that, and I decided that I have more interesting things to do. Now, the other thing to remember is, of course, and I always have to remind my students, is that unlike Israel that has, state archives, Palestinians don't have state archives, right? And so in terms of historical research, we're kind of stuck in terms of the kind of materials that we have access to. And to a certain degree, also depending on what we can find in the Israeli archives. right? Or become super, super creative, right? Whereas when you write about Tel Aviv, you have the Tel Aviv Municipal Archives, which I visited. And you have quite a bit, right? Tel Aviv from the very beginning had this sense of itself, right, as this historically significant site, the first Hebrew city. So Tel Aviv always documented itself, right? So you can really find a lot about Tel Aviv. Jerusalem is a different story, because Jerusalem has this, this long presence of Christian missions, right? It has long had interests by historical societies, archaeological societies, like a Holy Land, like Palestine, Holy Land type of groups that were interested in Jerusalem. And Jaffa didn't have that kind of interest, right? Also Jaffa, over the centuries, had periods where it really, really shrunk, right? And really didn't have a lot of, in terms of population, or a lot of, or much significance. And then it sort of grew again, right, in the 19th century. Whereas I think Jerusalem has kind of always had, right, you can really trace its significance, right, like strategic, cultural, so that kind of accounts for some of it, right? It's kind of important to remember. And of course, in Jaffa, you have the loss of the majority of its population. In a way that didn't quite happen that way in Jerusalem, right? Like in Jaffa, most of the Palestinian population were expelled. Whereas in Jerusalem, what you have in 1948 is that it was divided, so that part of the city actually remained Palestinian. So some people actually ended up staying. That also, of course, accounts for the discrepancies, right, in the kind of information that is produced on those cities.
One day, someone will engage in some sort of a comparative work or try to bring the two together. But I'm going to leave this to a younger generation of scholars. I want to ask about the goals of your book. If you can give us a sense of what you wanted to achieve when you start writing this narrative.
So, at first, I really wanted to talk about erasure, right? The way that Jaffa's Arabness, right, was almost completely erased, and what was left of it was retooled in order to fit better into being marketable, right, as this kind of oriental, quaint quarter of Tel Aviv, right? But it's more significant history, right? As an Arab Palestinian city was erased, and I was really interested in that, right? Like walking through the city, you can really see, right, remains, right? So you can see, for example, on buildings that used to be owned by Palestinians, right? So you can see different signs, right? Dedications, right, on buildings. The history is there. You just have to kind of look for it. And I became absolutely obsessed with it, right? Just walking with my feet. It's not such a big city, so you can really walk it. Walking and examining buildings really, really closely. And then later on, speaking to people, right? Because then people would ask me, what are you doing, right? And so it started as a excavation project, kind of, right? But it became something else, because if you're only treating a city, a place, as an archaeological dig, which is, I mean, that's also, criticism of archaeology as a discipline, right? You're ignoring, you're erasing the presence of living people, right? And the people that have used and lived in these spaces, right? So it kind of evolved from just excavation to understanding how people articulate their belonging to space, even if they're not physically in this space, right? Which led me to other places like Balata, right? And then, of course, as somebody who is has been an activist, I was interested in the future, right? So what can we do? So what can happen? So what are the options? So how can we see beyond the horizon of what is, right?
And I want to bring our conversation to the question of Jaffa. Now, you already mentioned a few things there, but I'm very curious about why Jaffa for your case study. And if you can, share with us why you chose this particular place, which I guess is also connected to the fact, as you said at the very beginning, you grew up in Tel Aviv. So for you, Jaffa is familiar. It's just, around the corner. And I was also interested in the narration, of the brief history of Jaffa that you recount in chapter 1, just to provide some historical context.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it was also important for the uninitiated. So those who have not read histories of Jaffa, to kind of provide some kind of background that presents Jaffa, first of all, not as this, decrepit, oriental, quaint quarter of Tel Aviv, not as, also not as a site of poverty or crime, which is sort of another image that the city has, right? But instead, really as a center of modernity, first of all, right? So Tel Aviv is not the quintessential modern city. Actually, obviously, Jaffa was as well. Jaffa is a hub of cultural production, of economic activity, right? Because most people, unless they read these histories, actually are not quite aware of it. And then, of course, once you build it up in chapter 1, then you can talk about the new normal in chapter 2, or the destruction of all this, right? You cannot start with 2 without 1. I had these conversations with my supervisor a lot. I was like, oh, but why do I need to actually go through all of the things that we know? It was like, and he said, you and I know. Don't assume other people know, right? And it makes the next chapter much more powerful this way, right?
You open chapter 2 with personal stories intersecting the discovery of a mass grave in Jaffa. And I must say that actually I was there. I was in Jerusalem when that happened. So I remember when I was reading the book, I was like, oh, actually I remember that. Can you tell us how was the Nakba forgotten and the state created then what you just mentioned, the new normal?
Yeah, it's funny because we were there then at the same time. One of the things that the starting this chapter in this way creates, one of the effects that it creates, it is about kind of dredging the past, right? Uncovering, right? So, of course, this chapter is all about concealing, right? It's the way that the state concealed and was quite successful in doing this. Jaffa is what was the very recent past. So it was easy for the state to do it because they managed to expel most of the Palestinian population, right? Once they walked into the city, what they had is a city that was mostly depopulated, so mostly empty, with the exception of a few thousand people that then, of course, the military concentrated into one area in Ajami. And for a year, they also held them behind barbed wires, right? And so calling that part, the barbed wire part, calling it Arab Jaffa, and then most of the city becomes Jewish Jaffa. So for the Israelis, it was actually very easy to remake Jaffa and remake Jaffa very quickly, which contemporaneous accounts really demonstrate, right? Being able to reallocate, right? So reallocate residential buildings, right? Give them away to Jewish migrants or give them away to families of soldiers, reallocate public spaces, reallocate stores, right? And absolutely remake the city in the image, right, of the state and Judaize the city. And they did it very, very quickly because they were able to cordon off the remaining Palestinian population.
A large group of Western mainstream media has a particular way of discussing Palestine and Palestinians, and we can certainly see that nowadays with the current events. And that often sounds patronizing, dismissive, and there are indeed exceptions. And I'm thinking about Mehdi Hassan or SNBC of Shireen Tadros, which used to work at Sky News and then left. And she left very much because of the war on Gaza in 2014, if I remember well. Can you tell us more about the personal narratives of stories of exile, which normally cannot be heard from the media?
So it's true that in Western media for years, right, for a long time you didn't even really hear the word Palestinian, right? It was just generic Arabs, maybe. But Palestinians had their other ways, right, of telling their stories and preserving memories. First of all, literature, right? Literature in Arabic, of course, which then, of course, doesn't really reach larger audience in the West, but Palestinians read it, right? And you have those that get translated. Hassan Kanafani, for example, that was translated. Hisham Sharabi, of course. Those who ended up really in the West, people like Ibrahim Abu Yod, right? People like Edward Said, right? Who were able to kind of narrate Palestine in public to Western audiences, right? And make a lot of people uncomfortable in an era where you really couldn't talk about Palestine, right? And the Palestinians also have other ways. For instance, within the community, within the family, right? Young Palestinians that I spoke with in refugee camps, they know very, very well where their grandparents come from, to the point of being able to describe, right? Repeat the description, the very detailed, granular description of their grandfather's neighborhood or village, right? And they also know where it is on the map, and they know what is there now, right? So I had these conversations with, boys who are younger than me, way younger than me, who were able to tell me that their grandparents came from, Jerusalem Unplugged, and they were able to tell me which Jewish neighborhood are there now and what it looks like and all of that, right? So Palestinians don't depend on, permission to narrate, right? Palestinians don't depend on Western media, right? Palestinians have always found a way to remember their own history, to write their own history, right? Even if in the West they have been ignored, right? And now you have, of course, in the more recent years, you have a bit more visibility for Palestinians in the West as well, through literature, through people like, yes, you mentioned Mehdi Hassan. I was thinking more about Ali Velshi and Ayman Mohyeddin, all three of them in MSNBC. I believe Ayman is half Palestinian, like Egyptian Palestinian. So, these hosts are kind of represent a new generation that is not afraid to say the P word. And by the way, with them also other non-Palestinian journalists and hosts that every once in a while I also see that say, hey, this is apartheid, or what Israel is doing is wrong. Like, sometimes I see that, right? And we owe a lot to the first generation of especially Palestinian American intellectuals that paved the way and got into a lot of trouble, right? And were demonized for that.
I want to talk about something that struck me in your book, because I think it's important, not just in the narrative, but I think it's important also given the current context. You talk about this idea of a Palestinian revolutionary consciousness. And again, we can't really go into all the current debates about this, because obviously there's a diversity of views and opinions after the events of the past 10 days. But I'm curious if you can focus on this concept as you discuss it in the book.
Yes, I'm not talking about current events. When we talk about Palestinian revolutionary consciousness, we're talking about the late 60s and early 70s. It's a completely different time. And obviously most people don't remember, but in the 1950s, Palestinians were the poor Arab refugees who are in refugee camps that were at the time mostly tents, right? And were surviving on charity, basically, right? On charity, right? Like UNRWA and other aid workers and so on. And then later in the 60s, you have the Arab League that started the fake PLO, right? That the early incarnation of the PLO, it was all about, you sit tight, we're going to liberate Palestine for you, which was always kind of laughable. So revolutionary consciousness is all about eschewing all that, right? Eschewing the poor Arab refugee depending on aid, but also kind of rejecting the very paternalistic and losing approach from Arab states. Don't forget, the Arab states also lost 67, right? Revolutionary consciousness is about, we are going to take our own fate into our hands, and we have to fight in order to liberate our country, in order to, return to our country. And there's a lot of talk about the new Palestinian, right? The fact that we have to shed all of those things that made us lose our homeland, right? That also all of those things that made us sort of be dependent on those corrupt Arab regimes, right? And it was all about, we are not going to engage in like the old type of Arab politics or the kind of international politics, right? Instead, just like Hassan Kanafani was writing about, right? We are going to join the guerrillas, become new people. It's about it. It's not just about collective liberation. It's also the liberation of the self. It's also kind of about rebirth of the self. Like, it has a very profound psychological, mental, emotional layers It's not, you know what I mean? Which is very hard to convey today to, for example, younger students who sort of say, wait, so you support Hamas? You know what I mean? Because they think that when I talk about sort of armed struggle for liberation, this is what I'm talking about, but that's not what I'm talking about. I have this feeling that Ghassan Kanafani would not have been very happy with Hamas. I don't know, because he was obviously assassinated, but it's a completely different process of the liberation of the self in order to achieve the liberation of the collective.
Which, in a sense, again, when I was reading the book, I was trying to draw this parallel with kind of early Zionism. I mean, one form of Zionism that was really preaching the idea of a new Jew, the Alutzin, the pioneer. So I feel like there was something interesting there, like the idea of a Geuleh, redemption. So again, there are different contexts, but there's also some similarities. At the same time, from an historical perspective, you're looking at an era where you have plenty of movements kind of developing this revolutionary consciousness in the global south, but even in Europe, where I grew up in the north of Italy, we had all of these, political, some of them turned into terrorist organizations later, mostly connected to, communist organization. And very much they preached on this idea of the new, individual. So there was a general attempt, I guess, to get out of a post-World War II era and somehow, 20 years afterwards, redesign humanity in a different kind of shape and form.
I mean, yes, it's not just even the World War II era, right? Like, even if you think about the Middle East and like the interwar era, so like between First and Second World War, right? Think about Egypt in particular, and the kind of intellectual movements that were very critical of what they call tradition, right? And so they offered their own ideas as to how to build this new modern Egyptian society that will be then worthy of true independence, kick out the British, right? Be like a real original leader and all of that. So I mean, some of it sounds today like a bit cringy, right? Because some of it is very Darwinist, right? Some of it is the new feminism, right? Some of it became very Islamist, but even like the Muslim Brotherhood originally started as kind of a very revolutionary movement that saw the transformation that is needed to happen at the very root of society, therefore working with like the poorest population, right? Not revolution from above, like Huda Sha'arawi type of thing, right? Or the communists. Some of them were, all about kind of the, vanguard, right? But like revolution from below. And so after World War II, and actually it's after 1948, right? In the Arab world, it's after 1948 is all these intellectual movements that were thinking, oh, how are we going to be able to rebuild Arab society and Arab consciousness in a way that will help us overcome this humiliation, and that next time we confront, the Zionists, we confront imperialism, right, we will win, right? And so there are different movements that came out of it, right, including Nasserism and others, right? I think in the case of Zionism, it's a little bit different because, of course, what you call the pioneer, like the pioneers, the making of the new Jew, has a lot to do with that strand has a lot to do with also, starting a very Europeanized colony in Palestine that would be worthy, right, of the respect of the Europeans, right? It's kind of a different movement. It's kind of a, I know that you're thinking, oh yes, it's about the remaking of the Jew, but it's a very different movement, right?
I just want to mention before moving forward, because you mentioned Hamas earlier, which is only from 1994 that Hamas eventually became militant and began attacking civilians, but effectively earlier was much more concerned about the well-being of the population. It worked almost as a charity organization and a political movement, but that's another story. I want to move to your chapter 4, and that reminded me that a few years back, I had dinner with Salim Tamari. Salim Tamari is a sociologist and historian from Palestine, certainly well-known and respected scholar. And I remember him talking about his memories of a city. And then, again, your chapter 4 is very much about Salim and Rima Hamami. And so I was wondering if you can share with us what you discuss in this chapter.
One of the very first things that I wanted to do is I wanted to trace the stories of Palestinians of Jaffa after 1948. So that the story of Jaffa doesn't start and end with the city, but rather the people who used to live there and are no longer there, right? And so in the book, there are 2 chapters. Originally, it was one very, very long chapter that had more elements to it. And it was really about tracing really different itineraries, right? Including revolutionary itineraries, and of course, refugees, the camp refugees, right? What happened to Palestinians in the intervening years, right? So you have people like Rima, who I later met, and Salim, who I'm at awe of, and slightly intimidated, and we're able to really write about their experiences, write about the histories of their families, right? And then there were people like the camp Palestinians that I met that most people don't come to listen to, right? Like, so when I was sitting in front of like elderly Palestinians in camps, it's not the first time that they tell the story, but usually they tell the stories to like their community and their family members. But suddenly this woman comes from outside, and not just a woman, right? An Israeli Jewish woman. This is the story, right? And like asking them about their lives, right? So it was the first time for a lot of them that they were being heard outside of their community in a way that made them very aware that other people are going to read their stories, right? And they were reflecting on that. They were saying, you have to tell them that we're still here. You have to tell them how we live. You have to tell them about how we want to go back. You know what I mean? Like, they were very, very aware that there is an audience, and it's not just me. Right, it's going to be written in another language, right? It was incredibly powerful to be sitting there and listening to stories, and I listened to way more stories than I ended up, including in the book, which really made me, it really made me think about our responsibility, right, as a historians, right, and the ethics of working with refugees and the ethics of working with, displaced people, and what it is that we convey, what it is that we silence, and so on. Right. It was a very profound process.
And I want to pick up on this, and if you can just talk a little bit more about the return and the memory of local inhabitants, and perhaps you can focus on the question of diasporic silence.
It's interesting that you're saying diasporic silence, because I actually felt that people were not silent at all. The Palestinians that I met in the diaspora are really, really not silent. Just this past Nakba Day, like 2023, I participated in a panel in Texas, in Denton, Texas, with two refugees, two elderly Palestinians who live in the US, one of them from Jaffa. And trust me, they were not silent at all. They had a lot to say, a lot of important things to say, and they were really interested in people listening to them, right? And they're also interested in like speaking to broader audiences, right? Where I did encounter silences are actually Palestinians who remained in Jaffa and experienced 1948. I did some research. I was sitting in this day center. It's like an elderly day center in Jabaliya. It's part of Jaffa, and they're all Palestinian elderly people, very nice people. And just spending the day with them and talking to them. And there was this one guy who was very talkative. But when I came to talk to him about the Nakba, he clamped up. He didn't want to talk. He was like, "Oh no, it wasn't that bad. No, we're happy to be with the Israelis. No. He was, it sort of took me by surprise. And then he said, I wrote a poem. Do you want to hear my poem? So I said, yeah, sure. He read me the poem in Arabic. And the poem was, of course, telling a different story, right? It was a poem about pain and trauma and loss. And it was kind of obvious that he was silent in a way that he didn't want to say explicit things. He was also jailed in the 60s, right, for political activism in Israel, right? So he had other ways of expressing what he wanted to tell me, right? So actually the silences often came from people inside, not from diasporic Palestinians, not from camp refugees.
That's fascinating. And again, you can see the multi-layer sort of structure of how people remember and tell stories. And I found it very powerful, as you said earlier. I want to move along the book, and you talk about the transformations of Jaffa since the Nakba. And you do it through the work of Gil Mualem Doron's work. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about who is he and a few things about his work. And you use his work to discuss this transformation. Can you also talk a little bit about the question of spatial resistance, which are deeply connected with this work?
So I met Gil when he was still living in Jaffa, right? He at some point gave up and left. But and he was always a political activist, right? He was always very embedded in the community. And so he watched with his own eyes how, for example, especially Palestinian, like it's working class Palestinians in Jaffa are being displaced, right? Through like house demolitions, through, this type of gentrification, but like gentrification, like extreme gentrification, very rapid one, right? He saw how, buildings in his street were kind of gutted in order to then remake them into fancy condos, which of course are not going to be marketed to Palestinians, right? He saw all this and he became incredibly involved, and that's his style. His style is obviously to use his art in the public space in order to attract attention, in order to raise awareness. Sometimes he gets in trouble for it. Like once, I forgot what it was about. He was actually arrested for holding a fake gun. He obviously, I forgot what was the act. maybe it was about crime, but he was even arrested for it, right? And so what he wanted to do is kind of create acts of provocation even, right? What he does is he believes that provoking Israelis would actually make them think, right, about displacement. So for instance, I describe Arab homes for sale, which was very clever. He had a booth in an art fair in which he had little models of Arab homes, right? And he kind of presented himself as a salesman, right? He's selling, these renovated Arab homes for Jews. It's the one thing that Israeli Jews love so much. Arab houses with the high ceilings and the big windows and all that. And the idea is, of course, to attract attention of Jews. And then if they get interested, then they can call this number. But when they call the number, that's when they're going to hear a famous Israeli song that is a patriotic song, but turned on its head because then it's sung in Arabic, right? Or, then if they're interested in purchasing one of the houses, that they'll realize that all these houses are actually no longer exist because Israel expelled the Palestinian residents and demolished the neighborhood, right? So it was very, very clever. Right, that's his style, and I mean also he was also working as an arts educator when he worked with Israeli students, right? And he forced Israeli students to really think about redesigning contemporary landscapes and to prepare them for the return, right, of the Palestinian refugees. So, he's I think, incredibly brave, right? He continues to do so, right, in the UK. And he's also, again, as an engaged artist, he's also very engaged in contemporary anti-racist politics in the UK, right? So, I wanted to really devote a chapter to different forms of protests against the transformation of the city, and displacement and house demolitions. And of course, Guillermo Arendon is one artist. There have been others who have been, in their way, right, creating these engaged public art.
And talking about return, in chapter 6, you discuss Zokrot and a proclamation of return, which was read in Tel Aviv in 2012. So you're looking at the Zokrot Badil project, which essentially is envisioning the return of the refugees. And you look at a series of imagined futures.
Yeah, so in 2012, that was, I believe, really the beginning of the transformation of Zokrot. So up until that point, from 2002 until 2011, 2012, Zokrot mostly focused on commemorating the Nakba, right? Sort of taking Israelis to sites of depopulated villages and telling the stories, right? And showing that, which is very important work, and they keep doing that. But they also went through a transformation of advocating for the return of the refugees. So talking about justice, right? Not just about commemoration. And so this project was very, 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 very experimental, because when we started, we didn't know where we were going to end, right? And also there were like a lot of internal tensions within the group, right? Around questions like, what is it going to look like once you're actually kind of forced to leave abstractions behind and look at the space and sort of think about how it's going to be used, who's going to live there, right? How it's going to function. This is where it gets dicey, right? This is where people who are otherwise very committed to the right of return will say, well, I don't know, right? Like, is that going to work? How is that going to work? What does that mean for the people who currently live there, and so on, right? So this project was good to sort of go through this process, right? It wasn't perfect by any means, right? I think if you read the kind of the textual products, you'll see some of these tensions. But I think it also launched similar projects. I think it also launched public conversations around the possibility of return. In the Israeli public, Palestinians always talked about return, so it really making Israelis talk about the right of return and not just about the Nakba, because I think it's the realization that there are Israeli Jews, like even on the Zionist left, so the so-called Zionist left, who have no problem commemorating the Nakba. They just don't want to think about justice, right? They don't want to redress, the injustice of ethnic cleansing. So this is why I think Zohar sort of made this pivot, and I'm so lucky to be invited into this project that absolutely transformed my project. My dissertation and then the book would not have taken this turn at all, because I then continued a discussion of sort of visions of return in chapter 7, right? Because I don't just talk about what we did, what we wrote as a group, but I also look at what others, through literature, right? What others are thinking about the return, right? So I talk about 2 short stories. One is kind of like more like, I read it and I was like, it's a little bit kumbaya, right? The Gandhi story written by an Israeli was a bit more kumbaya than the Palestinian written story, which was a bit like poignant and like, but do we trust them? But is there anywhere for us to return? But can we live with them? And so on, right? Which also came up in my conversations with refugees in the camp that said to me, I don't want to live with the people who killed my best friend, right? Or who besieged the camp, or, that it's not all kumbaya, that it's not all about sort of like, okay, thinking about post-conflict transformation and reconciliation, right? These are words that are thrown around a lot, but actually point to doubt, a lot of it.
And you said something that was buzzing in my head. I mean, particularly when we think about the left, whatever is the left, in Israel, commemoration, in a sense, it's easier. It's a good step forward, considering the amount of denial. But thinking about the return, thinking about reparation, that's a completely different discourse. And I think I must say that in your book, really, this comes out very powerfully, and I think it's very important to remember the difference here. Like, commemoration is one thing, but the reality of the return is a different one.
No, but the point is, and I guess that's sort of the kind of in the very end, right? I went through a process with this book, right? So in the very end, when you reach the end of the book, what I'm saying is, but we need to sort of think about these complications. And that's okay. That's okay if the road is bumpy. But this is the politics of hope, right? The idea that, fine, it's not going to be like we can't sort of imagine the post-liberation future as like this all, milk and cookies and bunnies and, but I mean, but we need to think about it, and we need to think about ways that we can redress injustice, but also at the same time, like I said to a friend this morning, but we all gotta, in the end, we all gonna have to live together, right? Like, we don't want anybody else to be ethnically cleansed, right? How do we not get to the point of another, ethnic cleansing to anyone?
Now, moving forward, central to your last chapters are South Africa and a trip to Cape Town. Can you tell us a little bit more about the trip and the connection with Palestine and Jaffa?
So this is part of the Zahot Badil project that I was invited into, and so they were thinking about taking activists on a trip to a place that where something similar may have transpired. They didn't quite know where, right? They were thinking about post-conflict situations, but this is not post-conflict. They ended up in South Africa because of apartheid, right? And because of colonialism. And so we ended up traveling together as a group, right? Israelis and Palestinians. Obviously, very important to say. And I said, and I note that in the chapter. I'm saying, well, we couldn't travel together, couldn't we? Even though we came from the same country, because of the imposition of, curbing mobility for Palestinians. Our Palestinian friends couldn't travel with us, right? They had to go through Jordan, which is already kind of a reminder, right, of the reality of apartheid, right? And we came to Cape Town, and we heard from people on the ground about the curbing of mobility during the apartheid era, which is something that resonated very, very well with this group, especially, of course, with Palestinians, right? We were taken to sort of key sites that, again, it was designed to sort of elicit these comparisons. So Robben Island, in the sense of, political prisoners, right? District 6, which is all about, the destruction, right, and depopulation and ethnic cleansing, right, of people. And specifically about District 6, there is also kind of a symbolic process of return and reparations. So a portion of the people who were ethnically cleansed from District 6, which is a neighborhood in Cape Town, that were expelled in 1966, over the last few years have received new homes in the vicinity of the original site, right? And so we went to visit them as well. And it, of course, made us think about the logistics, right, of return. So, and we visited a refugee camp outside of Cape Town, which, of course, made the Palestinian members of the group directly compare the experience of the refugees in Mandela Park to their own. And I remember they're saying, oh, wow, they are worse off than us, which I was like taken aback, right? I don't live as a refugee, so I can't even, I don't know, right? I don't know. So that whole visit, it's a couple of weeks, this whole visit was supposed to make us think about what is comparable, as in the things that are similar between the experience of apartheid in South Africa and in Palestine, but also it also turned into what not to do, right? Because the more we talk to people, the more we realize that they went about it the wrong way in the aftermath of apartheid, in a way that did not offer solution or justice, right? I think to most people, right? And so when we were sitting in those meeting rooms at the very end of the trip, we were talking about what it is that we don't want to do, what it is that we don't want to happen, right, in Palestine. And it was also a very visceral kind of experience, where Palestinians sort of, our Palestinian friends were really kind of empowered to talk about their own experiences of loss. I think it was a very good, I think it was very good obviously for them to like really air it, to really be able to powerfully articulate it, and for the Israelis to hear all that.
I have one last question.
Sure.
So in the conclusion, you have a series of pictures, and you have chosen one that I found personally very powerful, and that's the sign marking the Israel-Lebanese border. And you can only see the directions for the various cities. And it feels as the cities of Jerusalem and Beirut are not really that far away, and certainly they're not, and they were not particularly under the Ottomans. In an imagined future, that border could be one day open, and possibly it will be even, a great night out, driving from Haifa to Beirut for a dinner out on the Corniche. Now, I know I'm digressing here, but I wanted to use this image to have you talking about the conclusion of your book.
That point where we were standing near that sign is atop of a hill, but actually under our feet, so the bottom of the hill, was the tunnel through which the train that went to Beirut once went through, right? And in 1948, they tore out the rail, right, and completely sealed off that tunnel. And standing up there, of course, it made us all think, right, about open borders, because when you're standing there, what you don't see in the picture is the big gate, right? You're standing there and it's actually a military base. It's right by a military base, and there's a big, locked gate, right? So it's quite powerful to think about this place without the base, without the gate, and potentially with a much more rapid train going not just from Haifa, from Jaffa, right, to Beirut. Because of course, in Ottoman times, and I mean also after Ottoman times, right, people were connected in also, in terms of like family. I mean, what do you mean? People married across borders all the time. These borders are artificial borders, right? People marry. People went to school. I mean, in 1948, there were people in Jaffa who ended up being stuck in Beirut because they were in school, right? And they couldn't come back home, right? I mean, there are Jews that became later Israeli Jews that went to school in Beirut, right? Actually, in the dissertation, in the chapter that I omitted from the book because I'm going to use it in a different way, there is this guy who ended up being an Israeli intelligence official who went to AUB. Right. I mean, sure. And this thought that it's possible should be normalized, right? Sure. Right. We were thinking a lot about, living in Amman, working in Jerusalem. People who live in North America, what do you mean? We commute all the time. I'm just kind of hoping that in like the post-liberation Palestine, we're not going to be like the US depending on cars, but we'll have those rapid trains, right, that will connect us to places.
And on this positive note, this was Noa Shaindlinger, author of Displacement, Erasure in Palestine, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2023. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was wonderful to chat with you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.